History class with Dr. W. In the previous lecture, we talked about the Constitutional Convention and ultimately the Constitution, which was the final outcome of that convention. We now turn to the aftermath of that convention, which may be even more of a complex and involved process than the Constitutional Convention itself. We will discuss what has come to be known as the Great Debate, the public debate over whether to ratify and adopt the Constitution, which includes the famous Federalist Papers, which we will also discuss in this lecture and a few others to follow. Here is another moment when we need to forget how the story ends in our history and instead treat the events of that era as they played out at that time. It was no foregone conclusion that the Constitution would be successfully ratified, meaning that 9 of the 13 states would accept it. There was widespread opposition to the Constitution, and those who opposed the Constitution came to be called Anti-Federalists, and supporters of the Constitution, spearheaded by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, called themselves Federalists, and we're going to talk, of course, about the Federalist Papers shortly. But among the things that the Anti-Federalists were concerned about were fear of a strong centralized government, fear of taxation, concern that the nation was simply too big to be governed as one kind of organization, and fear of the Senate, which suggested to them rule by a wealthy few. When we think about fears of centralized government and fear of the Senate, these are the kind of things that we had just fought a revolutionary war to overthrow, right? Fear of a strong monarch, fear of rule by an elite few. So these Anti-Federalists had a number of different plans instead of accepting the Constitution. Some advocated starting all over again, throw out the Constitution as the convention had developed it, and just come up with a new plan. Others were more moderate and called for some amendments to be added and then adopt the Constitution. And still another position supported ratifying the Constitution first, with the understanding that amendments would be added later. And this kind of harkens back to our discussion previously about civic duty and an understanding among these men that all more or less accepted that the greater good would hold sway over their own individual needs and desires. And so it wasn't such an earth-shattering thought that we might ratify this thing first and then amend it later, because they all understood that that process could take place. So the quest begins to overcome those many public fears, the Anti-Federalist perspective, remembering that the ultimate goal is to win approval in at least 9 out of the 13 states. So to counter those fears, the Federalists began a speaking tour and ultimately launched a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers, which were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. I would just like to point out, first of all, how young these guys were. We think about the Founding Fathers as sort of grandfatherly, wise and old figures. Alexander Hamilton at that time was 32 years old. James Madison, 36, and John Jay, 42. So they were all reasonably youthful, although they were incredibly learned and wise. So Hamilton was the chief organizer of the writing of the Federalist Papers, and remember, his primary goal was to win passage of the Constitution in his very important and large state of New York. James Madison is from Virginia, and he is setting out to pursue passage of the Constitution in that state. They were both successful, by the way, but I would point out that their work was incredibly important because the final votes in both states were closer than we might want to think. And again, this points back to our argument. We have to consider what was happening at that time We know now the Constitution passes and in fact survives for up to this point close to 250 years. But at that time it was not a foregone conclusion. The vote in New York passed only 30 to 27 and mandated 33 amendments. In Virginia, the vote was 89 to 79, requesting 20 amendments. So the Federalist Papers seem to be critical in tipping public opinion just enough to win support in these key states and others to ratify the Constitution. Now, if we think about some of the general kind of foundations for the argument on each side and where they were coming from, all of these so-called founding fathers, again, they're deeply educated. They look back to the classics. But the Anti-Federalists tended to lean more in the camp of supporting a form of government similar to the classic Republican forms of government like the Roman model. There tended to be more kind of roots of aristocracy in their thinking. The Federalists counter these arguments by saying, well, none of them survived. Even if they had admirable components, none of them lasted all of that long. And we want to set about to form something new and even better. So they're going to make some arguments that kind of stray from some of those traditional views of Republican form of government. Many philosophers and thinkers had debated various forms of government over time. But one of the most influential on the founding fathers and that generation was the French philosopher Montesquieu, who had written The Spirit of the Laws in 1748. Montesquieu had undertaken a reconsideration of the classical form of republican government, which again relied on kind of an aristocratic rule. Montesquieu reinterpreted the idea of the classic republican government, shaping a view that was more democratic in nature. The ultimate power lay with the people. He argued in favor of small, manageable states. And so this is one of the concerns presented by the Anti-Federalists, that the United States are just too large for a democracy to work. He also believed that they must be homogeneous in nature, that all citizens really had to have one kind of guiding light and beacon that they followed. And Montesquieu actually argued they should all have the same religion as well. Montesquieu was influential particularly with the Anti-Federalists. When we think about Anti-Federalist perspectives in the big picture, Anti-Federalists argued that the primary role of government was to secure the rights and liberties of the individual. To the Anti-Federalists, politics and government in general was not so much a positive good as it was a necessary evil. They were, for the most part, suspicious of centralized government. And to the Anti-Federalist, human beings were generally corrupt and power-hungry by nature. And so the smaller the government, the better. Their primary concern was governmental overreach. And they were worried that the Constitution, in fact, as drawn up at the convention, gave the government too much power and that it would overpower individual rights. And so that's primarily what we're going to see in this debate between Federalist and Anti-Federalist, the debate between a strong centralized government and a debate arguing more in favor of the rights and power of individuals. So that's what we're going to be discussing over the next couple of lectures. We're going to look at the Federalist Papers and some of the debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists over the nature of government.